Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Today we're going to continue on with our Crumb series, and I'm going to show you how to start your blocks. And then what I did is I went through and I just did all the different steps in all different orders, and I'm trying to just splice all the videos together to make it cohesive and understandable. So if we jump from maybe the sewing machine to the ironing to the trimming at the cutting table, I apologize if it gets a little too confusing. Just let me know and I'll see what I can do. But most of it seems like it's going to be okay. So today we're going to be taking our beginning of our scraps, and we're going to start sewing our first few pieces together. We're going to start getting these blocks going. Then I'm going to show you how I iron them, and then we're going to go back to doing a little bit more sewing and make our blocks grow a little bit larger. Since I've already done all the work, these are going to be the blocks that I'm going to teach you how to trim up in a couple days. So okay, let's go ahead and get this started, and let's go over to the sewing machine and start working on our blocks. I have my sewing machine on a nice wide desk, so I have the luxury of taking my bin and putting it over to the left. If you happen to be sewing on just a table that fits your sewing machine, you might want to bring a little, like a TV table next to it, or prop it up on another chair or something like that. Because what I like to do is I like to have my bucket right next to me. Now this whole bucket is just too much and it could be overwhelming, so I tend to just grab a handful and just plop it on the table next to me, and that way it's easier to dig through and find if I want a long skinny piece or if I need a short fat chunky one. I also like to keep nearby, I'm right-handed so I keep it over, I have this little ramp thing I like to keep underneath on my right-hand side so I can grab it with my right hands real easily. So if I come across something like this where it has the selvage edge on it, I can just go ahead and trim that off. I could stitch and let that be in the seam, but then there's going to be that extra bulk in the seam that we just don't need. And then I keep a garbage can nearby so I can just toss everything into it. Or you can keep a little bucket and just throw it in there and then empty it in the trash later. In the beginning, I like to find one of these nice long, narrower strips. This one's probably about 1 3/4 to 2 inches. And I'll put that underneath my presser foot. Now when you're doing a crumb block, seam allowance is important in only the fact that you don't want it to be too narrow so that all the threads come out and your block will fall apart when you wash it. You don't need a large chunky one because of course you don't want to add any extra fabric to the back of your quilt. I just use the side of my presser foot. That gives me a little bit of about 1/4 inch or so. So I start with my long strip, and then I'll find maybe a small chunk like this, and I'll just lay it on top. I could lay it the narrow way this way, or I could lay it the long way this way. For some reason, I kind of like this way because then it's like you're building the center of your block. And then I just stitch this one. Then I peek in and I find another one. Oh, this one's a longer one. I can either trim this now, I can leave it, or when I go in and I start ironing my blocks, I can decide it's too long then, and then I can trim it. Maybe I really want to use this fabric. This is awfully large to start the center of the square with, even for me who likes to use large pieces. So maybe I want to take this and I want to cut it down the center. And just to be different, I'll put one up and down, and I'll take the next one and I'll lay it down lengthwise. If I were only making, say, a handful, like 6 of these crumb blocks, I might not want to use a long strip like this because then every block will have this in almost the exact same place. But since, I'm going to be making them dozens and dozens of them, I usually end up with about 40 or 50 of them each time I sit down to do crumb blocks. I'm not going to worry about it. Plus in the overall quilt that you're doing, if let's say 40 of your blocks have this same fabric, it kind of ties it all in, but chances are they'll never be next to each other unless you choose it that way. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep stitching on this one. I wouldn't use another one of these. These have little snails on them. They're really bright and colorful. I wouldn't use another piece of this touching this one, but I don't mind if two blues touch. If my piece is a little bit wider than the leftover piece that's on here, as long as it's a large enough piece, if it was really narrow like this, then I probably wouldn't use it. But there's plenty of space that I'll still get a usable piece of block out of it. Now, as you can see, I haven't ironed any of this fabric. I probably ironed it at one point when I took it from my giant scrap bin and I started separating it into the smaller scrap bins. But right now, that's not going to bother me. This is a crumb block. Most of the most of the wrinkles are going to come out when we go ahead and iron it. Then I just go ahead and grab another piece randomly and go from there. Sometimes it's a smaller piece. This one is a little bit of an uneven edge here. I can use this side, or I can choose to flip it around and use this straight edge. Now, the one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to get out my rotary cutter, and I'm not going to get out a ruler and make sure that everything is exact. If something's a little bit misshapen, it's going to be okay. You know how they say it all comes out in the wash? Well, with crumb blocks, it all comes out in the ironing. And for me, that's all I do when I start a crumb block. I just sit here and I feed fabric through bit by bit by bit. I might end up with a big pile in the back. I might end up with a big stack of all these little pieces all stitched together. Or maybe I only have 5 minutes to sew, so I might only get a couple pieces stitched on. It all depends on how my day is. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to the iron. We're going to separate all these pieces out and iron them or press them. I generally will have a much larger pile of string scraps, mini blocks, before I come over here to iron. But I'll just show you what I do with this little pile here. First, I have to go through and I need to separate each section from wherever it was at. I really need to go pick up one of those things that where you put the string down, the thread like that, and it separates it when you're chain piecing like this. I just only think about it when I'm in the middle of quilting and sewing, and I never think about it when I'm actually on the computer or looking to purchase things. Now, when I have pieces that are together like this, when I first started doing crumbs, I would just go ahead and iron it and fold it over and do it then. But now I've learned that it's easier for me if I go ahead and just snip in between these blocks and separate them. And that way I don't have to deal with the long strip, and it just it tends to get a little bit wobbly and funky for me. But you know, you do you, whichever one's going to work for you. Maybe try both ways and see which way you like. So I'll go through and I'll do this with my entire stack of however long and however many pieces I happen to manage to sew for that day. Even when I'm ironing crumb blocks, I like to go ahead and set the seam. And then I decide, I like to always press it to a piece that has a solid piece. Not as solid in color, but as solid as in there's no seams. Because a piece that's going to a solid piece like this with no seams is going to sit a lot easier. Let me see if I have one. Like this piece here that when we just sewed 2 blocks together, there's no actual, sometimes you need a little steam if you need it. There's no real solid piece without seams, so you're just going to have to decide which way. Like when I push it this way, it doesn't really want to go this way, but I feel that the seam wants to go this way. So I'll go ahead and press it to that direction. I generally press them mostly to the top. I'll press from, sometimes I'll press from the back. Sometimes I've got to go and do it both ways. But it seems all the blocks we've done today so far have been just as simple, no big seams in them. Because in the beginning, you're really just stitching one piece of fabric to another until you get to a larger piece. So just go ahead and go through your entire stack and get them all pressed. Sometimes I'll have a day where I'll just sew one day. Oops. Now look at this one. I sewed that one on backwards. In a regular quilt, you're probably going to notice that sticking out. But in a crumb block, by the time I add the next square on like this, it's not going to be that noticeable. You're just going to think it's a light piece of fabric. I'm not even going to worry about that one. I'm going to leave it like that. If it bothered me, I would not take that seam apart. I would just take my scissors and I would trim that right off. But for this one, I'm going to leave it because I like the way the colors look together. Oh, look. Apparently I wasn't paying attention at all when I was sewing, and I did it with this one also. That's what I said. On days like this, I don't really want to be working on a real project, something that's using big chunks of expensive fabric where I need the blocks to actually look a certain way, because on days like today, I am going to mess those blocks up every time. But on these crumb blocks, even if I decided I didn't want to take this piece apart, this is such a small piece that it's not going to hurt my budget, or it's not going to hurt my heart or my feelings or my craft room. I can just throw this away. If I'm having that bad of a day where this really just going to make me cry, because sometimes, let's face it, it's not about what's happening, it's about how your day's been going, I can just throw this away. No stress, it's gone. That's the point of working on crumb blocks, making your own fabric. It's a stress-free situation. If you have to worry about something, then how can that be relaxing and enjoyable? Working on big quilts is relaxing and enjoyable for me, but not on a day where maybe I have a headache or I haven't slept well, or I just realized I need to put brakes on the car after I just put new tires on the car, and now, you know, where's the money going to come from? We all have our own different levels of stress, and we just have to find ways to deal with it. Okay, here we go. Here's one. This one has a seam here where these two go together. This is one solid piece of fabric. So I'm going to iron it to the solid piece of fabric. And that way I only have the seam going here, and I won't have, when this would fold over, and I'd have 3 or 4 pieces of fabric put together. We're going to stick with our little bits that we had just started with for the beginning of our blocks, and I'm going to show you how I trim them up. Now you can trim them any way you want, but I do like to use my ruler and a rotary cutter on my cutting mat. You could easily just use scissors if that's all you have right now. My blocks are going to be 6.5 inch square because I kind of like that size, and at that point I'm really tired of making them. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to use to trim these up. Here's our little mini strip block that we're working on. Now it's obvious that this is the last piece we added on because the rest of them are nice and evenish. So this piece is going to be trimmed here. And it's got a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch on this side that can be trimmed off. Now depending on how you want to work your crumb blocks, I like to just take it and I just trim off this piece. And I just kind of slide my ruler off and trim off that side too, because I could sit there and flip it this way and trim it and all that, but that's a lot of extra steps and a lot of extra work when I just feel like just whacking at things today. Now I have this little piece left. Yes, you could use this for a crumb block if it's a large enough piece, which this one would work. Depending on what the design is on the front, I could save this in my ticker tape bin and add this to another quilt. So you're really not throwing away but this little tiny sliver that I cut off. So this one I am going to save for my ticker tape. Unless as I'm going through making these and I end up trimming off like 12 of these, then maybe I might not want to save all of them. Now as I'm trimming these, the next step, I don't want to keep sorting and fumbling and touching and moving these around. So I'm going to take this strip and I'm going to set it over into a pile over on the side of my table. Now next time I get another one that's about the same size as this one, whether it's the same width or about the same length, I'm going to take it and add it to that pile. But when I have a big piece like this one, I'm going to put this in a separate pile. So when I go and I start sewing things together, I know I can easily take these two and say, oh, they're about the same size, so I can just stitch these together and make a bigger piece. I don't want to be trying to add it on to different spots where it's not going to be long enough. It's just easier for me if I keep them separate. I don't go crazy about it. It's not like if one is 4 inches and one's 3 inches, I don't put them together. As long as they're close, then I'll go ahead and put them together. Now here's the one where we stitched the 2 blocks together. So I'm just going to lay, as you can see, I'm still way below the 6.5 inches. So I'm just going to lay it on here and just whack it off. If I were closer to the 6.5 inches, I'll show you on a larger block later, then I might be a little bit different on how I put my ruler down. Now once again, I have this little skinny piece. That's about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch there. Now for me, when I put another piece of fabric on there, what I could do is I could fold this piece over, stitch along it, and then cut it along that fold area. But for me, this piece on the side is just too small. I don't want those in my quilt. If you want those in your quilt, then feel free to leave them in there, because it does add that little extra bit of it. Sometimes you can do a little I Spy and look for the little pieces, but I just cut it off, leave a little bit right there at the seam, and then this will go in the trash. And then I have this piece to put it back into my little bin and add it to another block. I could almost add it to this block, but as you can see, it's quite short. If I add a second piece onto this, then I can add it back into this block if I felt that this block needed this piece of fabric. So I set this off up here and I make a separate pile for that. So that's pretty much my process. Just pop it in there, slide it over, because right at this point we're not being precise. It doesn't have to be an exact, perfect straight line. I'm going to go through and trim these up and put them in their little piles, and then they'll be ready for making larger blocks. As you can see, I've been busy. I've done a little bit of sewing, some ironing, and some trimming. This is what I mean about stacking them into similar piles. After I do all the trimming, I don't want to just take it and sort it afterwards. So as I trim it, I take a piece and I put it in a pile, and it's about the same size as these are more of like the random longer ones. You know, they're not exactly the same, but they're close. So then I'll take these over to my sewing machine and I'll take this whole pile and I'll just start matching them up and stitching these whole pile to this whole pile. Then I'll move on and I'll take this stack and I'll just randomly put them together and sew those together. And this is how you can quickly build your blocks, because once they start getting bigger, then it goes really quick. Especially when you start getting up to the larger pieces like this. Now these I won't be stitching to much of anything unless there's something that's really close to a match, because like this one right here is already over, either at or over 6.5 inches. So this one just needs to be made a little bit wider. But there's a lot of just singles and doubles in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take these over to the machine, stitch them all together, and go through the same process. You stitch them, you press them, you trim them, and then you sort them back into piles again. So now you've seen how I like to start my blocks. In the beginning, it seems like it takes forever, because all you're doing is you're taking these little pieces and you're stitching them together bit by bit, and even though a 6.5 inch block isn't very large, it sure seems to take a long time to get that point. But don't get discouraged. Just keep taking your little chunks and stitching them together. If you don't go crazy like me and try to make 30 or 40 blocks at once, you know, maybe only start with 10 blocks or something, your blocks will go together a lot faster. For me, what I do is I just take that little bin and I grab that handful of fabric, and as long as I have the time, I just like to sew until that stack of scraps that I use has been stitched together. Because I know eventually I'm going to be able to take all those little bits and sew them together into a larger block. So once I get to like phase 3 of the process of stitching pieces together, trimming them and pressing them and coming back and stitching them together again, I'm going to be really close to the 6.5 inch block that I want. So it's a good thing to look forward to, that it may feel like it's dragging out right now. Just don't make your pile of scraps to start with too big, and it won't take as long. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them down in the comments, and we'll pick up again hopefully tomorrow, and I'll see you then. Bye.